Number one, perspective. You can use different angles to change the feeling of any shot. If there's a shot that you want, but the first attempt was kind of iffy, then a simple change of perspective may get you what you're looking for. There's four basic types of perspective: low angle, high angle, lateral movement, and first person POV. Low angle brings the viewer back to a child's perspective. The world seems so much bigger, and your subject is much more superior at this angle. This angle is achieved by simply being lower to the ground than your subject and shooting up at it. Take this city, for example. The lower that you shoot, the bigger the city looks. Typically, when we look up to something, we value it highly. The same goes for photography. Next, high angle. High angle can make your subject appear smaller and increase depth in your image. Try getting above your subject and shooting down at it. It can also make your subject appear inferior, so keep this in mind. Next, lateral movement. This is basically moving from left to right on a lateral plane, or right to left. Take this for example. 3 different images of a road taken at 3 different positions on a lateral plane. You can position the camera on the right, left, or the center, and anywhere in between to change the viewer's perspective. Try out different lateral positions while photographing a subject and see which angle you like most. And first person POV. POV stands for point of view. First person point of view shots are great because it places the viewer in the eyes of the photographer. It creates realism by placing arms or legs in the shot. You can get a wide angle POV shot like this by using the pano trick that I talked about earlier, or a wide angle on a newer iPhone. Number 2 is vantage point. This is one of the most helpful concepts for photographers to find great photos everywhere they look. A vantage point is a point of focus created by leading lines. Your eyes like to be guided, so we use lines in everyday life to steer or lead the viewer to a single point. These lines can be found in almost anything: buildings, streets, trees, mountains, water, and plenty more. These lines begin at the outside of the frame and travel inward to a single point. There are 2 different types of leading lines. There's geometric and organic. Geometric lines are found in streets and buildings. They're straight and much more obvious to follow. Organic lines are often found in nature, such as mountains, rivers, pathways, trees, or even reflections on the water. They tend to bend and curve much more than geometric lines, but always lead to a specific area. These lines can simply be the contrast between light and shadow, or between colors, like a green mountain against a blue sky. Here's a good example of geometric leading lines to one vantage point. Here's an example of organic. And lastly, this one doesn't use exact lines, but rather the bottoms of the trees all line up to lead to a single spot. Number 3, rule of thirds. Rule of thirds was created by John Thomas Smith back in 1797 when he wrote his book on remarks of rural scenery. And it's actually less of a rule and more of a guideline. So this old guy staring at cows and tall grass had a point though. Rule of thirds is the act of separating your frame into 9 parts, but most importantly, 3 different columns. And between those columns are 2 different lines. So you can place a subject on the left line or the right line to draw attention to the composition as a whole rather than one single centered point of focus. This is often done by placing a person on either side of the foreground and placing another subject on the opposite side in the background, such as a mountain or a lake or a building or a sunset. This is where the grid function comes in handy on your iPhone. Check out this image, for example. If the girl were in the center, your eyes would immediately go straight to her. But since she's positioned on the left third of the frame, your eyes now focus on the entire image, girl and background together. Neither angle is wrong, but the rule of thirds gives you the option to include the background as a second subject in the scene. If you're taking a picture with a human subject like this one, rule of thirds is also great because it gives you a wider picture of what the subject is looking at. It tells a story, which we're going to talk about later. Surrounding light and how to use it. Surrounding light, whether it be natural light from the sun or simply a street lamp, can be your best friend or your worst enemy, depending on your direction. This seems kind of obvious, but most people don't realize it. Shooting in the same direction that the light is traveling can brighten up your entire subject and the scene. So if everything is too dark, you should try changing your shooting direction to match the direction of the light source. On the contrary, shooting into the light can create a really nice silhouette if positioned properly and exposed properly. Exposure is the amount of light per unit area. This is just a fancy way of saying how bright or how dark a picture is whenever you take it. The best time to shoot in almost any setting is at golden hour, which is the hour right before sunset or the hour right after sunrise. This is because the light is softer and coming from one single direction, closer to the horizon. Here's some examples. This was shot facing into the light, which creates a really nice silhouette. A silhouette is when your subject is completely dark against a bright background. This shot was taken more facing into the same direction that the light was casting. The subject is well lit and so is the background. Here's a diagram of the difference between the two different shooting directions relative to the light source. Neither option is wrong. It just depends on what style that you want to achieve. Last but not least, dead space. This is a good way to capitalize on a great photo with minimal searching. Dead space is considered any space behind a subject that does not have other elements to distract the viewer from the subject. Use it to highlight a single subject with nothing more than a wide open area. This is achieved best with backgrounds that are very far away or empty or have one general tone of color. And you can use rule of thirds with dead space to mix things up and bring a little more tension into your shot. How to create depth in your photography. Understanding what depth is in photography is just as important as using it. Depth is the feeling of distance and separation from your subject. Many of the best photographers in the world use one simple trick to add depth to their photos. And by simple, I mean very simple. They show us the ground. Take this photo of a city skyline, for example. You can add a lot more depth to this photo by simply taking the picture vertically and exposing the ground. The importance isn't in the camera rotation as much as it is in showing how far away you are from the subject. The subject being the city. The easiest way to do this is by showing the ground in your shot. Here's another example of a great shot. But here it is with far more depth because we've exposed the street below. When you think about a printed photo, you typically think of it as two-dimensional, meaning it has an X and a Y axis. But the trick is to introduce a third axis, which is the Z axis, by positioning your shots to include more depth.